guys. I'm gonna go ahead with the first story of the evening, and coming from our favorite continent, Australia. Australia is now going to fine firms up to 50 million Australian dollars for data breaches. They've approved a bill to amend the country's privacy legislation, significantly increasing the maximum penalties to $50 million for companies and data controllers who suffered large-scale data breaches. It also said the financial penalty introduced by the new bill is set to whichever is greater, AU $50 million, 3 times the value of any benefit obtained through the misuse of information, and 30% of the company's adjusted turnover in the relevant period.
Woo!
What does it say about this?
I'm a little torn on this because while I think it's good that there are consequences to data breaches, right? I don't think that it should be applied across the board. I think that some companies get hacked despite their best efforts. And those companies are already handicapped because the Australian government does not allow hackback, right? So companies can't do everything that they should be able to do because there's laws that prevent them from doing so. So I think fines for gross negligence makes complete sense, and I fully support that. But I'm seeing fines without those fines actually going to the people impacted by the breach. So I feel like the legislation may be good, but I'd like to see it be more specific, if that makes sense.
I want to say one thing. You mentioned Australia doesn't have hackback, and this story actually happened on November 18th, where they were planning to launch like a hackback plan against cyber attackers.
Well, so I think that's the Australian government, which will do hackback, but they still don't let individual companies hack back, right?
I see.
So it's like, the World Cup is currently on. It's like if you had a soccer team, but you could only play defense, right? So you're not going to win that way. You just lose.
Defense wins games, Steve. No. In actual reality, I think it's really interesting that they did a 30% of revenues. When you look at probably one of the most sweeping laws from the EU, only does 2% with a cap of 10 million. I think that 30% seems significantly high for an Australian law, right? If GDPR is going to do 2% or up to 10 million, 30% uncapped seems a little excessive, but again, that's my opinion.
Yeah, I think the threshold, like John's saying, the amount of the fine, either percentage or cap, 40 million, it's almost like if a regulation makes you say, well, who needs ransomware gangs when you got the Australian government? There's something a little off. Maybe it's the level. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I love the percentage. Like that makes a lot of sense because, right, obviously, if you're a small company, you can't afford 10 million,
right,
or 40 million or whatever. But at the same time, it makes a lot of sense. Like you got to cap it at some point, right?
Yeah,
30% seems excessive.
I think that we already have a situation where companies have to only play defense. They have to be right 100% of the time. The hacker only has to be right once to break in. Data breaches are already the leading cause of small businesses going out of business. And now you're going to have these across the board stiff fines. I think it has to be applied in a very reasonable manner. And I didn't see that in the law. I think if you're a giant Australian company who is wildly negligent in how you treat data, sure, great, like stiff penalties. But if you're a small business that did everything that they could, and they still got hacked, then there should be some sort of grace. So I think that written into the law, there needs to be clear language saying that this has to be for negligence, this has to have been preventable before any fines kick in. And I also think that the dollars should not go to the government, even though the government would never agree to this. The dollars should go into a pool that provides insurance to people negatively impacted by the breach.
So there's
100% agreed with the comments and agree with that. What I think is interesting is the people who are making the assumptions of whether this was gross negligence or whatever have no technical expertise whatsoever.
Well, so the lawmakers don't, but that there should be, so in the US, there's plenty of committees, right? That there should be a committee of cyber professionals in Australia.
Yep.
That should be able to weigh in on situations, right? Like,
Yes.
I would say if you got a committee of cyber professionals weighing in on the Uber verdict, 9 CISOs out of 10 would have said, don't send that guy to jail, right? So
100% agree. And
Because
I
they've
think
lived-
you're reiterating the point and completely agree.
Yep, because they've lived they've walked in those shoes.
yeah,
You
if
know.
you're a judge who is not an expert in cyber law, you're not able to definitively say how cyber law should be interpreted. And yet that's the situation today. Sorry, you were saying something, Connor?
Yeah.
No, you're good. There's two things I want to add. So earlier we were talking about small businesses being affected by this. Something I want to point out is the new bill is set to whichever is greater. That means the minimum penalty, the minimum maximum is 50 million.
Yeah,
So that's the greatest. And then to add to that,
no, that's the minimum, right?
The minimum.
what, 50 million is
Yeah.
the minimum. And then if you exceed that, it's higher.
So
that's-
if you're Kangaroo Coffee and you make $1,000 of profit a month,
50 mil.
then
You're out of business,
$50 million.
out of business.
But there's something else I want to chime in on. On sequitur to that point, we're talking about, having committees in place that are experts on this. The second bullet is, I like this one personally. 3 times the value of any benefit obtained through the misuse of information. To me, that actually implies some sort of negligence, right? The rest of the other two are kind of just really high numbers thrown out there.
Well, but how do you?
So my concern with that is you're not looking at long-term value of the data itself, right? Like,
How do you know what the value of the misuse is, right? Because like,
I'll use it now, I'll use it 6 months from now, I'll use it a year from now.
I could steal the data and then I could sell it, but then it could be used to create another data breach. So is the value of me selling it, or is the value of misusing the data to cause another breach? And then value a minimum of 50 million, because that's the fine. So
I'll leave with one parting point. I'm not sure if we're allowed to call out individual names, et cetera, but I can't imagine like a Bernie Sanders trying to acknowledge a data breach and acknowledge $50 million versus the cost of a data breach, right?
I don't think there's any politician, I'm unaware of any politician that could coherently talk about data breaches in a fair and reasonable way.
Yeah.
Yes, I would 100% agree. I just used probably one example. You can go any side whatsoever. I don't think anybody could actually try to acknowledge and pass legislation that fairly addresses data breaches.
And that's the problem, right? Whenever, like, if you hate our problems, you're gonna even more hate our solutions. Whenever government tries to solve a problem, they usually make it worse because you're not governed by the most qualified, you're governed by the most electable. And so
Yes.
we have these privacy laws and data breach laws. And they're not being written by experts in the field. And they're usually written to be overly vague, so either they're ineffective or they're misapplied.
Yes.